Hi everybody, how's it going? This is the Ayaneo Pocket DS. I've been playing with it for the past few weeks, and I have some thoughts about it that I want to share with all you people out there who's thinking about ordering this device. For the people who don't already know what this is, it's basically an Android tablet, but you make it into the form of a plus-sized Nintendo DS. You can run Android apps like emulators on here, and the main gimmick of this device is this flippity form factor with the two screens within, so you can recreate the DS and 3DS experience. This is a retail unit I bought with my own money, and all opinions are my own. So without further ado, let's get straight into the review. First things first, let's quickly go through the specs and price of this thing. It's running a Snapdragon G3X Gen 2 processor, which is basically a rebranded version of the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, which is found in most flagship phones from 2023, such as the Samsung Galaxy S23. It's also found in other competing handhelds like the Ayaneo 2 and the Thor. It has slightly lower Geekbench scores than the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 in the Odin 2 and has a slightly higher 3D Mark score. You can push more wattage into this chipset to get a higher score, but it quickly overheats and stabilizes to about 3800 points. The top screen here is a 7-inch 1080p OLED screen with a maximum refresh rate of 165Hz, and the bottom screen is a 5-inch 4x3 LCD screen with a resolution of 1024x768 and a maximum refresh rate of 60Hz. It has an 8000 mAh battery with a 27-watt charging speed. Its physical dimensions are spec'd at 180mm long, 102mm wide, and about 25mm thick at the thinnest part, with the thickest part along the grips at about 34.4mm. Ayaneo specs its weight at about 540 grams, and my unit here weighs about 529 grams. It comes in the following RAM and storage options, from 8GB of RAM and 128GB of storage, all the way up to 16GB of RAM and a terabyte of storage. Note that it only comes in black except for the highest spec model, where you unlock a yellow and black option, and you need to pay an additional $40 on top of that to get this one with the gray color. Obviously, the retail prices listed here are absurd, but unfortunately that's just their pricing strategy. Okay, so first impressions. This is really a chunky boy, and even though it's called the Pocket DS, it's definitely not pocketable. My unit here is 529 grams, and even though that doesn't sound too heavy, but because it's relatively compact, it feels very dense in the hands. And the closest I could describe it is that it almost feels like holding a plus-sized battery bank. This is what it looks like compared to a DSi XL, so that's the chunky version of the DSi. And this is what it looks like compared to the Ayn Thor. I don't have a DSi, so this is a 3D printed model of the DSi. And this is a 3D printed model of the new 3DS XL. The top side here is made of an anodized aluminum with a sandblasted-like finish to it. It feels cool and smooth to the hands and doesn't get smudgy too easily. There's also an Ayaneo logo at the center, which seems to be laser etched. The metal here definitely contributes to its overall weight, but it also adds to the premium feel of this device. When you hold it in your hands, it feels extremely sturdy and stiff. As you can see, there's actually a small gap on the sides here to make space for the buttons and the joystick, but because the top side is made of aluminum, the entire top feels stiff and sturdy, and there's almost no flex when you hold the device at its corners. The bottom part here is made of plastic and has a smooth surface finish that is very similar to the Odin 2, and when I first got the device, it took about 5 minutes for the back casing to get all smudgy with fingerprints. So this is what it looks like after a couple of weeks of usage. I haven't wiped it down at all during the time, and this is basically how it looks. So on the bottom here, we've got a couple of logos and a fan intake. The grips on the bottom feels well designed, so you can hold it with a palm grip, and basically the weight of the unit falls on your middle finger nicely on the groove over here, and the device feels perfectly balanced. You can also hold it with a claw grip, and this is where the bottom bumps come into play, as it improves the grip on your fingers. Of course, we're limited by space and size, so the ergonomics can't be that good. The weight also doesn't help. On the back here, we've got the USB Type-C port, the triggers and bumpers, as well as 2 additional programmable buttons. By default, these map to the Android navigation buttons, but you can customize them in Ayaneo software. I'll quickly go through the options so you can pause and check them out. We've got nothing on the sides, and on the front side we've got an SD card slot. Unfortunately, there's no 3.5mm audio jack. So over here we have a thin little platform that extrudes a little bit compared to the screen, and this is where the top screen comes into contact when you close the device. We've got these 2 rubber bumps on both sides that acts like a cushion. There's a mic opening in the middle, and then there's this indicator light that tells you if the controller is in mouse and keyboard mode. For the current software version, it seems to be bugged, so you trigger mouse mode by long pressing the start and select buttons, and we see this light lights up. But then it seems to just disable the controller and do nothing else. And in top screen only mode, you can always use the bottom screen as a mouse pad, regardless if you enable mouse mode. Maybe it's still work in progress? It would be nice if you could configure your controller as keyboard strokes. Then you can, for example, stream or emulate PC games that extensively use the mouse, like RTS games. We've got a bunch of buttons in this bottom area, and it gets quite overwhelming. Like, even after a few weeks of use, I still press the wrong button all the time. So we've got start and select over here, the power button with the fingerprint sensor and the volume rockers over here. Then we've got 5 additional buttons. Now, 3 of them are programmable, and you can pause and guess what's the logical way of picking out 3 buttons here and make them programmable. And it's these 3. So by default, both of these are the Android home button. I guess so you don't get lost. And this button cycles through your power plans. But then pressing this brings out this control panel thingy, and you can select your desired power plan here directly instead of slowly cycling through everything. This button to the left brings out this menu that allows you to switch screen modes. But then you can also press this button and click the screen to access this menu. So let's just say that you got a lot of options. We have forward-facing speakers at the bottom corners. They get pretty loud, but the sound is pretty muffled. The game controls are your typical Joy-Con-like arrangement. The face buttons here are about 8mm wide, which is slightly larger than the 7mm buttons on the DSXXL, and they feel pretty similar, with a very short travel and a dome switch-like clicky feel to it. They also sound quite similar, and I'd say that stiffness is about the same, maybe a little bit stiffer on the Pocket DS. The D-pad, on the other hand, definitely feels stiffer than the D-pad on the DSXXL. It clicks like a dome switch, the travel is very short, and it has very little rocking motion when you pivot around the center, as compared to the DSXXL. Personally, I'm not a fan of this D-pad for games, but it does make the device feel more premium because it feels sturdy, and it doesn't rattle at all when you touch it. The joysticks are indented, and they're almost beneath the surface. The travel is pretty wide, basically the same as an Odin 2, so a slightly smaller range than a typical controller, but better than the Joy-Cons. The thumbsticks are also replaceable and is compatible with the Odin 2 thumbsticks. These thumbsticks are made of a hard plastic and is quite slippery, and there's definitely less grip compared to a rubber thumbstick, like those found in Odin 2 or Thor. There's also hardly any texture around the thumbsticks, which doesn't help with the grip. I feel that my fingers are constantly catching along the edges here, and I have to constantly readjust my finger position. See, if I put my thumbs here, I can push it all the way to the right without any issues. But if I were holding it near the center, my thumb would slip and I'd be pressing pretty hard on these edges. I'm also not a fan of the shape of these thumbsticks. I feel that they should have gone for more of a convex shape like the sticks on the Joy-Con or like the RP flips. These concave shaped sticks work well when your stick is extruded, but in this situation when the sticks are indented, I'd say a convex rubbery stick with textured edges would work a lot better. The joysticks here uses Hall effect sensors, so you can turn off the dead zones. They seem pretty accurate and smooth, but there also seems to be some cardinal snapping here. So if you take note of the joystick values over here, I'm slowly rocking the joysticks back and forth. but the joystick values aren't changing at all, and you'll have to move the stick far enough away from the cardinal axis for the changes to register. I'm not sure if this is a feature or a hardware limitation. Maybe they enabled the slight cardinal snapping so that you could more easily use the joysticks as a D-pad, but it's definitely going to influence dual-stick gaming, for example if you're streaming a modern game from a PC. The bumpers here have a dome switch-like click to them, and it feels great, and can easily trigger at different points. If you're using a claw grip, you can trigger them with your fingertips, and if you're using a palm grip, you can trigger them with the middle part of your finger. The triggers, on the other hand, feels quite cheap and hollow, and I personally don't really like them. So when you bottom out the triggers, instead of stopping, it's actually still a bit squishy. So it always feels like you're deforming the triggers when you bottom them out. The trigger itself is also very light and hollow, without much weight to it. Also, on my unit here, the bumpers of the left rattles when you pull the triggers. So that probably also adds to the cheapness feeling. I've seen people complaining about the bumpers getting stuck, so it might be a potential design issue. Another thing I personally don't like about the controls is the vibration. It feels exactly like the vibration of a phone, and I just kind of feel like I'm getting text messages while I'm beating up mobs here. The hinge here feels very stiff, almost too stiff. Maybe it gets better over time as you break it in, but for now it actually takes a bit of effort to flip the screen out. Compared to my old DSXXL, it's actually very easy to pry the lid slightly open. The torque gets large up to about this point, and then it just sort of snaps into position. Then there's 3 positions it can snap to. The Pocket DS, on the other hand, is a lot stiffer. You gotta use a bit of force to pry it open. Then the torque is basically constant throughout the range of motion, and you can set the screen to any angle you like, and it only snaps into position at 180 degrees. The screen is quite stable and doesn't wobble around at all, while the DSi-XL screen gets quite wobbly. So you can shake the handheld around without influencing the screen's position, and that's definitely an improvement over the DSi-XL. The hinge on the Ayn Thor, on the other hand, is a lot more similar to the DSi-XL than the Ayaneo Pocket DS. It's basically effortless to open, but it only snaps into 3 predetermined positions, and you can adjust the screen's angle to whatever you like, even though it's also a lot more stable than the DSi-XL. There's a sensor in this hinge so that the device can wake itself up when you flip it open. But there seems to be a bug on my unit here that makes everything inverted. So if you flip the device open fast enough, everything's fine. But if you do it too slowly, the device just wakes up and goes back to sleep again. And then it turns on when you close the lid and goes to sleep when you flip it open. Maybe I have a faulty unit, or maybe it's a software bug that can be fixed later through an update. Now I know that a lot of you guys are probably worried about the durability of this hinge, but unfortunately I can't really evaluate its durability. I saw this disassembly video from Bilibili, and it seems that the hinge is fixed on an L-shaped metal part that's relatively large and sandwiched in between the handheld's internals. And the structure seems reassuring because the plastics around the hinge, which is usually the weakest link, aren't really involved here structurally. What I'm worried about more is actually the parts around the hinge. Because the hinge is so stiff, it actually exerts a lot of force on its surroundings. And you can see how it flexes everything and also how it affects the bottom screen. You might have already noticed the awful backlight bleed here, and it seems to be a common issue with this device. In this video on Bilibili, this guy fixed the backlight bleeding by taking apart the device and adjusting the torque on a couple of screws. Even then, it's not a guaranteed fix, since gravity can pull on parts that can deform the screen. You have to squeeze foam into the nooks and crannies to make sure the internals are supported enough without putting too much uneven pressure on the screen. You probably already noticed, but there's 0 visible screws, and I'm not sure if any of you actually consider that a positive. I feel like this is a consistent theme with Ayaneo devices, which is a lot of form over function. They go out of their ways to hide all the screws, just to make disassembling this device and fixing it yourself more painful. And I don't think that should be encouraged. And we finally come to the main gimmick of this thing, the 2 screens. The top screen is a 7-inch 1080p OLED screen and has a maximum refresh rate of 165Hz. As an OLED screen, the top screen is vibrant and colorful and gets pretty bright. Bottom screen is a 5-inch LCD screen with a resolution of 1024 by 768. It has a refresh rate of 60Hz, and it doesn't get as bright as the top screen. And you have to separately adjust the brightness for each screen to your preference. Even though the top screen is capable of a pretty high refresh rate, if you enable both screens, the top screen will be limited to 60Hz. And if you want to take advantage of the high refresh rate, you'd have to disable the bottom screen, which kind of beats the purpose of having two screens. So for example, streaming a PC game at high refresh rate with a video or a guide down at the bottom wouldn't be doable, at least for now. Maybe they could do a 120/60 mode like the Ayn Thor, but I'm not hopeful, because according to my understanding, it's an Android limitation, and Ayn probably did something with their display controllers to let the bottom screen take in a 120Hz signal with some screen tearing, which I doubt Ayaneo did, but we'll see in future updates. The size and resolution of the screens are actually pretty perfect for DS emulation, as you can do a perfect 4x integer scaling on the bottom screen, and if you do a 5x integer scaling on the top screen, the display area is about 98% of the bottom screen, and because the top screen is OLED, the borders just blend in with the bezels, so it's a pretty great recreation of a plus-sized DSXXL. When you actually configure the emulators though, getting integer scaling is tough. For Jurassic, you can only change a percentage to make the top screen smaller instead of performing pixel-precise tweaks. On Melon DS, since you can't enter pixel values, you'd have to fight with the slider a bit to get precise pixel values. Also, for the current Melon DS build, you have to configure the top screen using the bottom screen's resolution. Basically, you have to do some math and figure out that this should be the width and height of your top screen. So you can't really be pixel precise. Hopefully, this will be fixed by the developers at some point. Anyways, I don't think being pixel precise mattered that much for DS games, because the screens are already high-res enough. On Melon DS, you can use the OpenGL renderer and render 3D graphics at a higher resolution to make the graphics extremely sharp, almost like a remastered game. Coupling that with an LCD shader, it actually feels pretty magical. Like, just look at how great Mario looks. Unfortunately, the 2D sprites are still low-res, but what can you do? It's a 20-year-old handheld game. So the screen setup is pretty great for DS emulation, but the slight imperfection is that, because the two panels are so different, they really have a very different color profile. The top screen as an OLED screen is very saturated and contrasty, and the bottom screen, well, it's just your typical LCD screen. The color temperature is also quite different, with the top screen slightly reddish and the bottom screen slightly greenish. On top of that, some colors just look different on the two screens, as you can see in the game Contra. This is a game where the background environment spans both screens, and you can obviously see the waterfall's color is very different on the two screens, compared to the Thor, where the colors are basically identical. I've also found out something weird about the color temperature of the top screen. So at 60Hz, the screen is slightly reddish, but as you increase its refresh rate, it gets bluer and bluer. I don't really notice a difference in colors other than white, but I'm also not particularly sensitive to colors, so your miles might vary. 3DS games, on the other hand, is less of an issue, since most games display different images on the two screens. The bottom screen can be displayed without any borders, and the top screen's small border is basically invisible. This chipset is powerful enough to emulate 3DS games at 4x the resolution, and a lot of these games look like remastered versions. Of course, the 2D assets are still low-res, and the difference in image quality can be quite jarring. Now let's do some comparisons of the screens. This is what the Pocket DS looks like next to a DSi-XL. They have a very similar screen-to-body ratio, but obviously the screens are way more vibrant and colorful on the Pocket DS, even the bottom screen. Compared to the Ayn Thor, this is what it looks like when we make the top screen as large as possible. And this is what it looks like if we configure the screens to have the same size on the Ayn Thor. In this case, the Pocket DS do have a significantly better screen-to-body ratio than the Ayn Thor. And this is what the Pocket DS looks like next to a DSi, and you can see how small the DSi looks in comparison. In 3DS games, this is what the Pocket DS looks like compared to a new 3DS XL. We can see that the screens are bigger, but the screen ratios are pretty similar. The Pocket DS also has a higher screen-to-body ratio. The Ayn Thor, on the other hand, has a much smaller bottom screen. But for 3DS games, I don't think it's too much of an issue. It does have black borders on the bottom screen, which will be pretty obvious for non-black models. Okay, so let's talk about how the two screens work. So the top screen is your main screen, and you can interact with it like a regular Android device. Like if you just ignore the bottom part, it's the same as using any other Android tablet. The bottom here runs Ayaneo software. So you've got a tab here where you can set the screen modes, and there's some jank right there. There's an application drawer with all your apps, and you can launch an app on the bottom screen from here. There's a task manager that manages all your apps on the bottom screen. And it's also pretty janky. Like, you can't swipe to close apps, you have to click on the menu button, and sometimes you have to click it many times to close the app. And half of the time, the preview image is just wrong. You know, I bet there's some guy out there who's trying to show a friend his shiny new Ayaneo Pocket DS, and then some unfortunate browser history shows up here. And then in this tab, you've got some quick toggles, and you can adjust the brightness and volume. The eye up button also brings up a special menu with a bunch of settings. When you're running an app on the bottom screen, there's also this hidden button, which is pretty easy to misclick, which brings up this menu. You can close or minimize your app, or push your app to the top screen. Or you can also swipe around with 3 fingers to move the apps around. Some apps, like ESDE, crashes when you try to switch screens, and it's a bit annoying. Because in order for the dual screen emulators to work correctly, you have to launch the emulator from the bottom screen, which is the internal screen of this device. See, if you launch Melon DS from the bottom screen, it works fine. But if you launched it from the top screen, the bottom screen is just not recognized. Considering you're probably playing most other games on the top screen, if you want to launch your games using ESDE, you'll be constantly restarting ESDE. So I think you really have to use this thing as an Android device instead of consoleizing it with a front end. Then everything we've talked about would be a non-issue. Like, you just start the emulator on the right screen and choose your game and so on. A workaround I found was that I basically hacked ESD's APK and changed its name so that I could install 2 instances of ESDE. Then I could use one as a launcher on the top screen and use the other on the bottom screen. So if I wanted to play a DS game or a 4x3 game, I could launch it from the bottom. And if I wanted to play a 16:9 system like the PSP, I could do it on the top. But it's still pretty cursed. Like, if you launch the wrong version of ESDE from the bottom screen, everything just crashes. Ayaneo does have its own front end called Iospace. You can use it as the default launcher, and also launch another instance on the bottom screen. But there's still some jank. Like, the UI will get screwed up sometimes. Now, a side tangent. If you're wondering how I set up Iospace with all the cover art and metadata, well, I didn't. This is a popular community-made project on the Chinese internet. Basically, a group of people packaged a bunch of ROMs and emulators into this single package that is like a one-click install. They specifically made a version for this device with pre-configured emulator settings and pre-installed shaders and overlays. And they also customized the version of the Pegasus frontend with some of their changes as the main frontend. And Iospace basically just imports metadata from this frontend. It's a little iffy considering the Pegasus frontend is released under the GPL, and they don't seem to have open sourced their changes. Ayaneo claims in their ads that you can scrape game metadata from their cloud database. But I don't think you can scrape metadata from the internet yet using Iospace. I can't even figure out how to import the metadata scraped by ESDE. So I just want to put that out there to not give Ayaneo credit for this look. I'm also not confident that Ayaneo would prioritize development for Iospace, considering this Pegasus G thing is already pretty polished and popular. If we compare to the dual screen situation on the Ayn Thor, we've got the same thing on the top, where you can just use it like any other Android tablet. And then the bottom is just a list of your apps. You can launch an app here, and to switch screens, you just launch the same app from the other screen. ESD also does work here, but it also randomly crashes sometimes. There's one unified task manager on the top screen, with a little indicator of which screen the app is on right here. So if you want to only use the bottom screen, you're a little screwed. And the AYN button down here in the middle brings out a menu on the bottom screen where you can change screen modes, adjust the brightness and volume, and there's some more settings over here. And this button in the center just brings out the task manager. Even though the software here seems very minimal, it does cover all the important door screen functionality, and even adds some additional quality of life features compared to the Ayaneo, such as the unified brightness control over here, and the separate volume controls for each screen, not to mention way less bugs. I also think it's a more elegant design that is easier to use, where everything is clearly laid out and easily accessible. For instance, to clear background apps, you click the AYN button, then the settings button, then you just click the icon that says clean memory. Well, on the Ayaneo, you gotta remember to click the Aya button instead of the 4 other buttons. You gotta click on this RAM section, and then click on it again, and then click on this one-click acceleration thing. And it doesn't even tell you if RAM is cleaned. There's also like 4 different ways to access the dual screen menu. So you can click the dual screen button, or you could click the 3 dots, or you could go home and click the screen, or you could click the Aya button and then the screen. On the Ayn Thor, it's just this button in the center, and then right there. The screen situation is also flipped on the Ayn Thor, because the top screen is the internal screen. This means that you have to launch dual screen emulators from the top. But that's of course less of an issue, since you're running most games on the top screen anyways. But it also has its own problems. For instance, Drastic wouldn't work, because it doesn't get touch input from external screens. Melon DS is also problematic because on an external screen, the touch events are stretched on the entire screen. So if you keep the aspect ratio on the bottom screen, the touch inputs will be slightly off on the edges. But this will probably be fixed by the devs in the future. Drastic, on the other hand, is just what it is, since it's closed sourced and already abandoned by the author. Alright, enough of the dual screen shenanigans. Let's talk about the gameplay experience on this device. As we mentioned before, DS games have never looked better with the 2 big screens, especially with the high-res rendering of 3D graphics. Touch inputs work as expected, as well as the mic, so you can play all the DS gimmicks as intended. The difference here is the capacitive touchscreen versus the resistive touchscreen on the DS. In some games, it's an upgrade, such as in Pokemon games, because now you can just gently tap on the screen with your fingers instead of tapping the screen hard with the stylus. In other games, it can be annoying, since you're blocking a huge chunk of the screen with your hand versus a stylus. Your fingers don't feel as precise as the tip of a stylus, and the movement also feels quite different. You can of course use one of these styluses for capacitive screens, but then they're also pretty chunky, and there's no place to store them, and I don't know why, but they all feel kinda laggy to use. Maybe it's because of the weight that makes them less agile than your finger or the DS stylus? But the bigger problem is latency. Rhythm games definitely don't feel as responsive as a native DS, and in a lot of games you can see the lag between the game and your fingers, such as in Rhythm Heaven, you can see the little dot in the game clearly lags behind my fingers. I was ready to blame the lag on the emulator until I plugged in a mouse, and suddenly there's no lag between the mouse cursor and the game cursor. Obviously, there's still latency between the physical movement of my mouse and the on-screen cursor, but at least we see that the latency introduced by the emulator is not that absurd. I think what's happening here is that Android is filtering the raw touch inputs and adding acceleration curves to the input data. If we turn on pointer location in the developer options, we can see that the pointer location also lags behind my finger, just like in Rhythm Heaven. With pointer location enabled, I also discovered that the lines drawn using the Pocket DS bottom screen is kinda jaggy. See, I'm drawing a circle slowly, and see how bumpy the edges gets, compared to the top screen or the door screens. This bottom screen also has a slightly lower touch sampling rate at about 95 Hz, even though it's only marginally lower than that of the top screen and the screens on the Thor. During day-to-day use, I did feel that the bottom screen felt a bit laggy, almost like how the old LCD Steam Deck felt like. I thought it was just Ayaneo's software being laggy, but maybe it also has to do with the quality of this touchscreen? I then took a slow motion video of the two screens on the Pocket DS, the Thor's bottom screen and the DSXXL, and I tried to align the point of touch input as best as I could by aligning the vibration on my finger. And this is what the delay looks like. The video is taken at 480 FPS and played back at 30, and by my estimates, the Thor adds about 60 milliseconds of lag compared to a native DS, and the bottom screen on the Pocket DS does seem to be consistently laggier, about 10 to 30 milliseconds. But we also have to remember that it's normal for LCD screens to have a response time of up to 10 milliseconds, and the screens only update at a 16 millisecond interval, so 10 to 30 milliseconds is pretty close to our margin of error. Anyways, while you can play your favorite rhythm games here, you're probably not beating a record. If we just do some napkin math here, let's say you're playing to a 4/4 song that is 120 BPM, the gap between 16th notes would be 125 milliseconds. And 60 to 90 milliseconds of lag added to the native DS would be a huge chunk of that. Also, I've had a bunch of crashes with Melon DS on the Pocket DS. Like, the gameplay will just freeze out of nowhere and then just crash out. And I'm not completely sure if it's an Ayaneo problem or a Melon DS problem, but I have been playing on the Thor and the Retro Pocket Mini with the dual screen attachment without as many crashes. For 3DS games, the obvious advantage over original hardware, of course, is the ability to upscale the graphics. However, since 3DS emulation is still very much in development, some games will have graphical glitches or crashes. Also, you're gonna get massive shader compilation stutter when you play through a game for the first time, so it's not like it's a complete upgrade over original hardware. Also, there seems to be something wrong with the gyro. So when I first got the device and tried a 3DS game in Azahar, the gyro is flipped. Later, after an update from Ayaneo, the gyro is fixed in Azahar, but it's still weird in Yuzu as well as this gyro tester app. Now, since this is running something that's basically a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 like in the Odin 2, it can handle most retro emulators up to PS2 without any problem. And from the 16:9 screen on the top to the 4:3 screen on the bottom, it can pretty much handle all screen aspect ratios with ease. The screens are big enough and things doesn't get too squinty even when you're streaming PC games, and latency is also pretty good when you're streaming. Switch emulation is kind of a mixed bag. Some games like this plumber racing game works perfectly, while this Genshin Impact clone sequel just crashes all the time. Also, gyro doesn't work for now. Wii U emulation on Android is also in its infancy, and frankly, for the same games, I doubt it will ever get better than Switch emulation, considering we have native code execution on the Switch emulators. The dual screens and the touchscreens work, but for some reason you can't sleep and resume, the game will just restart. Ayaneo provides the following power profiles for you to choose from. So there's the battery saver, which they're calling Eco, the balanced, and the high performance modes, which they're calling gaming mode. The streaming mode is basically the high performance mode, but you limit the clock speeds while keeping the CPU scheduler on high. And max just unlocks all clock limitations and go ham on power delivery. The fan speed in max mode is like a jet engine. And in my testings, I don't think it's even worth it. In Geekbench, gaming compared to max have a similar multi-core score, but way less single-core score. That's because Ayaneo limited Core 7's clock frequency in the game mode profile, and if we simply unlocked the default clock limit on Core 7, we would have a very similar single-core score too. In 3D Mark's Wildlife Extreme stress test, even though we get elevated performance in the first few minutes under max mode, it quickly overheats and stabilizes to around 3800 points, which is also only just marginally higher than game mode. So I'd say max mode is not worth it, considering the fan noise and power draw. And even at low fan speeds, the fan on my unit here has an annoying high-pitched whine. So that's unfortunate. The good thing is, the device doesn't really get very hot, and the battery life is pretty great. In Melon DS, running Super Mario 64 DS at 5 times the resolution, we get about 8 hours of battery life. And Azahar running Pokemon X at 4 times the resolution gives us about 6.5 hours of battery life. Running Plumber Race Car 8 in Eden, we get about 4 hours, and Wind Waker HD in Cemu gives us about 3.5 hours of battery life. Compared to the Ayn Thor, the Thor has a similar performance in benchmarks, and while it has a smaller 6000 mAh battery, it actually has pretty similar battery life because of its less power draw. Okay, so a little recap of this review. The Ayaneo Pocket DS is something that has a single very strong strength, which is the 2 big screens, but also has a bunch of jank in the details. Some of it can probably be fixed with future software updates, such as the UI jank and the gyro. Some of it are design choices or compromises that you may or may not agree with, such as the size and weight and the analog sticks. Some are flaws that's probably unfixable, such as the backlight bleed and latency issues. Also, since this is basically the first dual-screen Android handheld, the software scene is still in its early stages, so there'd be a lot of bugs and imperfections, and needs time to mature. I mean, most of the work to make emulators work on dual-screen devices seem to be spearheaded by just this one person that's super enthusiastic about dual-screen devices and half the technical know-how. Compared to the Ayn Thor, which is the only competitor out there right now if we're talking about flipping handhelds with 2 screens, the Ayaneo Pocket DS's strength is obviously the screen size. Not just how massive they are, but also its layout that faithfully recreates what DS and 3DS games look like. But I think everything else works in favor of the Thor, with its more compact size, consistent screen colors, and a similar performance at a much lower price. The Thor definitely has less software features, but it's sufficient and has less bugs. I mean, if there's no software, there's no bugs, right? Anyways, I'll be testing the Thor a bit more to pick out more flaws, and we'll see if I change my opinion. I also don't like Ayaneo's pricing. They're setting the retail price so much higher than the early bird price to create a sense of fear of missing out. I personally think that if you're not hell-bent on the screens here, just miss out and dodge all the jank. Anyways, that's all I want to say in this video. If you found the information helpful, please consider giving this video a like, and subscribe for more content like this, such as the upcoming review for the Ayn Thor. See you in the next video.